free movement between Australia and New Zealand, where geography clearly plays a factor. So, pan-European supply chains do tend to, be sort of aided by having a sort of ability to rapidly deploy, whether it's engineers or sort of consultants at a moment's notice. So there is a genuine reason for geographical purposes for why that's a preferential scheme is ideal.
Yes.
Maybe I could just add a few broader contextual points about this idea of the indivisibility of the four freedoms and the cherry picking, because I think we can analyse the Chequers Statement and the White Paper on its own terms. Another important set of questions, the interrelationship with the withdrawal agreement, particularly Northern Ireland, but then we have the questions about how it interrelates with the European Council guidelines and especially the indivisibility stroke cherry picking provisions. Again, in the report I did for the European Parliament, I go into this in quite a bit more detail, but I'll just summarise the key points. First of all, this isn't a constitutional requirement of the EU. There's nothing in EU law which says the four freedoms are indivisible. There's nothing which says that you cannot enter into trade relationships which offer greater or lesser degrees of market access in certain sectors than others. So it's not a constitutional principle that the four freedoms are indivisible or that you can't cherry pick. This is really about a political imperative. And this is the EU basically saying, you cannot get a better deal by leaving than you had by being in. And it's just a very simple political, rational self-interest principle. It's worth bearing in mind that it's not new or unique to the UK. It was really first articulated in relations with Switzerland after the Swiss had their immigration referendum and wanted to introduce restrictions on free movement. There we saw the EU really for the first time articulate back in 2014 these principles, and of course the UK government signed up to them, which is part of the reason that it feels a little bit difficult now to go back and say we don't agree with this anymore. But these aren't new, they're not unique to the UK, and they are essentially political rather than constitutional. And I think what that means is that they have to be seen as part of a package. Basically, the less the UK asks for in some sectors, the more it can get away with in others. So if, for example, we're talking about fully fledged common market for goods, then the EU will begin to feel uncomfortable about offering that without also extensive provisions on persons, because it will destabilise the relationship with Switzerland. That's exactly what the confrontation with Switzerland was about. Whereas if the UK is effectively saying we can live with no common market for goods, but the avoidance of literal border checks, this is simply about not having border checks, primarily for Northern Ireland, then the EU might say, well, that's not that different from what was on offer already anyway, so we can live with a mobility framework for persons. So I think it has to be seen as part of the much broader package. What is it we're asking for and what is it we're prepared to give in return?
Very quickly, I think it's got on this indivisibility point.